Woke up this morning with the terrific urge to lay in bed all day and read. Fought against it for a minute, then looked out the window at the rain and game over. Put myself entirely in the keep of this rainy morning. Would I live my life over again? Make the same unforgivable mistakes? Yes. Given half a chance? Yes. Hello, and welcome to Words That Burn, the podcast taking a closer look at poetry. This week's poem is Rain by Raymond Carver. I stumbled across this poem recently, and this is the first episode after an unplanned summer hiatus for this podcast. July and August got away from me there for a little bit, but I'm happy to be back recording episodes. This poem was the perfect callback to the microphone. It is September at the time of recording, and I couldn't think of more apt words for the arrival of that month, and with it autumn. It feels as though Ireland, as a place, shares that sentiment, as it's done nothing but rain for the last few days at the beginning of the month. There is many a day in autumn that we have been torn between surrendering to our bed and trying to make something of the day, only for the rain to firmly dissuade us of that notion. Poetry is not something you might associate with one of the biggest names in American literature. His influence on the short story, particularly the American short story, is what has solidified his legacy as a titan of the written word. That reputation is wholly earned. Carver's short fiction is hallmarked by a sparse prose that somehow conveys more in what is unsaid and left out than what we see on the page. This proved a little contentious with some critics during his lifetime, as many felt that his devout minimalism equated to a less is less final story. On the other hand, it is that same economy of detail that allowed Carver's readers to see themselves in his stories, to fill the gaps with their own interpretations and experiences, and ultimately relate more to them because of it. It's a little like one bell's vibration causing another to ring in tandem. If there's a better metaphor for reading a poem that stays with you, I can't think of one. His contribution to prose is indelible, but to overlook his poetry would be madness. After all, this is the man who once stated, "When I'm writing poems, I feel there's nothing in the world so important. You know, as far as I'm concerned, I'd be happy if they simply put poet on my tombstone." He also attested that he built his short stories after the fashion in which he wrote poetry. His dedication to poetry was clear. Why was Raymond Carver so taken with these short forms though? What was it that lured him in? The answer is suitably pragmatic. He didn't have time to write anything longer. Raymond Carver began writing in his early 20s. By that stage, he already had 2 children, a wife, and had declared bankruptcy. He found himself in a constant financial struggle, working an endless parade of blue-collar and part-time jobs. Carver himself put it best in an interview where he said, "Nobody ever asked me to be a writer, but it was tough to stay alive and pay bills and put food on the table, and at the same time to think of myself as a writer and to learn to write. After years of working crap jobs and raising kids and trying to write, I realized I needed to write things I could finish and be done with in a hurry. I needed to write something I could get some kind of payoff from immediately. Not next year or 3 years from now, hence poems and stories." Why am I taking the time to tell you all this? It's fairly essential to interpreting this poem that you understand some of what drove the early writing career of Raymond Carver. Understanding Carver's difficult early life is essential to interpreting this poem, especially the third stanza, which seems equally laced with regret and acceptance. But we'll get to that later. Over the course of this episode, I'm going to show you how Raymond Carver used the same techniques from his short stories to create glimpses into the lives of others that seemed inappropriately intimate and universal, all in the same breath. In stanza 1, Carver uses a technique that identifies much of his writing, a true sense of immediacy. Woke up this morning with a terrific urge to lay in bed all day and read. Fought against it for a minute. In that opening line, there is a distinct lack of pronoun, no self-serving I. Carver chooses instead to focus entirely on action, with the verb woke being the first thing we read. In doing so, he immediately pulls us into a scene, an experience that no human avoids. Waking up in bed and wanting to stay there. I is noticeably absent from the entire stanza. With that, this stanza could be a scene being described to us, a snapshot in a film. It could be ourselves recounting our own morning. In abandoning the traditional syntax of subject, verb, object, Carver's imagery tumbles at us fast and barely formed. Removing subjects and syntax, ellipsis by any other name, was one of the ways that Raymond Carver brought fragmentation into his work. It is a rhythmic and stylistic inclusion. It moves much of his writing from description to experienced imagery. It also creates what would become known as Carver's staccato rhythm. For me, this rapid imagery technique moves me from considering the scene as an outsider to almost experiencing my own version, cobbled together from my memories of similar experiences. In an opening stanza that is filled with objective reporting of a scene, there is a single towering adjective used to emphasize the speaker's struggle. The terrific urge to lay in bed all day. In so sparse a scene, that single adjective packs all the more punch. It is a testament to the way in which Carver could allow his reader's interpretation to form the text. Terrific could describe the scale of a battle being waged against a lazy day. Or it could be an attempt to communicate how wonderful it is to want to remain safe and warm in your bed. The skill that Carver has for poetry and his dedication to form and technique is evident in the enjambment he uses to end the stanza. Enjambment is the continuation of one line in a stanza into another, essentially bleeding lines together to control the pace at which the reader reads. We feel a languishing urge to stay there in that bed with the speaker. The staccato rhythm of the much shorter sentence, fought against it for a minute, simulates the speaker's own flash-in-the-pan resistance. There is a delicacy and care taken in how Carver has put this poem together. What is, at first glance, a typical use of the sparse writing synonymous with Carver himself, a style that would become known as dirty realism, is actually revealed to be an intricate and subtle unfolding of a moment in 3 lines. Academic Arthur F. Bethia notes that it is this care for detail that marks Carver's poetry as distinct from his prose. He writes, Carver's poetry is poetry because it has technique beyond narrative. The exact word matters. The line matters. Sound matters. Structure matters. The exact placement of words on the page matters. Before we move on to the next stanza, I have a favor to ask. If you've been enjoying this episode so far, please consider following the podcast or subscribing to the YouTube channel. Better yet, please consider reviewing the podcast wherever you listen or sending it to someone who you think might enjoy it as well. You can find links to all the places the podcast can be found and the Substack with full essays and citations that you're hearing in the description below. With that being said, on with the show. The second stanza uses enjambment to move us from a speaker in the middle of a struggle to one who surrenders. Then looked out the window at the rain, and game over. Put myself entirely in the keep of this rainy morning. The stanza break gives us a pause to feel the smooth transition from the action of a fight to the surrender of looking out a window. The rain seems almost welcome now. The last grains of resolve tumble away with a simple sentence. And game over. The personal suddenly inserts itself here, almost exactly at the midway point of the poem. I think of it as a signifier that all resistance, once symbolized by objectivity and lack of self-indulgence, quite literally by the lack of I, has fled our speaker. Now, there is only the embrace of the bed and the natural softness that comes from it. The speaker feels safe. The final line of the stanza embodies how we all feel when safe, hidden away while the rain is relentless outside. We are all happy in the keep of a rainy morning. As surrender comes in, fragmentation leaves. The second and third lines feel a little more complete, a little more fleshed out. Then abruptly, the poem shifts from a simple scene to a moment of profound reflection in the third stanza. Would I live my life over again? Make the same unforgivable mistakes? Yes. Given half a chance? Yes. Two questions and a resolute answer. This shift symbolizes another of Carver's favorite techniques, one that is another form of fragmentation. It is the pivot from extrospective, the world of the environment, the material, and the concrete, to the introspective, the realm of self and memory and dilemma. Much of Carver's writing focused on the former. He leaned heavily on an almost visual cinematic style of description and place, meaning that when he did choose to suddenly reveal the vastness of a character or speaker's internal world, it struck the reader like a bolt from the blue. The sudden thundering intimacy is so unexpected that it strikes us all the more. This, like the single adjective in stanza 1, is that single detail in a wide open plain. We cannot help but be drawn to it. While researching how Carver would often use this single detail to devastating effect in his work, I read Ayala Amir's amazing book, The Visual Poetics of Raymond Carver. In it, Amir uses Roland Barthes' theory of the punctum from his final work, Camera Lucida. She uses this theory to explain how Carver's writing was so effective. Whilst it is a term used for photography, it is remarkably prescient to poetry in general. Most of Carver's writing is concerned with what is called by Barthes the studium. That is the obvious, the culturally accepted interpretation of things, the way we are programmed to move through the everyday. In Carver's work, the studium is a working class world. It is a series of American suburbs filled with people doing their best and often coming up short. It could be argued that his entire canon is made up of split-second tragedies. In the 1980s, though, when Carver's work was skyrocketing, this was the real America, beyond the myth of excess that Hollywood would have had you believe. Carver was a man who understood the ordinary American. He could see that the most ordinary of lives held just as much potential for tragedy as Shakespeare. He recognized the most universal of emotions in the everyday. In this poem, it is the universal want to stay in bed and avoid the rain. Then comes the punctum of the poem, quite literally invoking the puncture or rupture from the norm. For Barth, it was the single detail of a photograph that connected directly with the viewer. It is out of place, meaning resistant, but forces us nearer and nearer, sparks our need to understand. Carver would bring these moments of punctum to us in glimpses of a character's inner life, or a single heartbreaking detail out of place. In this poem, it is the oddly sinister revelation of our speaker having some unforgivable mistakes in their past. I mentioned earlier in the episode that understanding Carver's struggles were the key to understanding his poetry. After the constant exhaustion of his early life, Carver fell into alcoholism that would plague his life for nearly 10 years. It would lead to the collapse of his family and the end of his marriage. He would come to embody the tragedy that so many of his characters went through. In fact, this hard way of living would lead to a very short life. Raymond Carver died due to cancer in 1988 at the age of only 50. He was made aware of this diagnosis in its very early stages. Poetry became his way of reflecting on the world in the final years of his life. The poetry began to act as a kind of biographical footnote for his short stories, each poem providing an insight into the themes and motifs that would cement him as a giant of literature. Carver himself admitted that the speaker in his poems was himself, and that his poetry was the more personally revealing of his writing. His impending death meant that mortality became a lens for self-reflection. As critic Harold Schweizer wrote, Carver's poetic tense is narrative retrospection. He projects in order to remember, hopes that things will be different, warms his shivering existence by the fire of his own rekindled death in order to remember his life. This is perhaps an unnecessarily gothic and slightly too grandiose interpretation, but it's useful in helping us understand the closing of Rain. Yes, he admits to terrible mistakes, but what you might notice, however, is that in this perfect moment of bedridden surrender, there is no regret. The poem ends in a decidedly resolute rejection of regret. Syntax is there and fully correct in the final two lines of the poem. Its presence seems to indicate resolve, or better yet, contentment. Two questions with correct question marks present and accounted for. One strong answer, replete with commas and full stops in all the right places. Yes. Given half a chance, yes. Rain by Raymond Carver is a testament to brevity. A poem that proves dense metaphor and intricate imagery is not essential to a poet's toolkit. A simple scene approached with care and a meticulous eye for technique can be just as affecting as the cleverest of poems. In 3 short stanzas, Carver takes his audience on a journey of warm solitude that paints a whole world in a few short utterances. More than that, its final stanza somehow embodies every bittersweet feeling I've ever felt about September. It's an ending time as the year begins to close its doors, the time when we all retreat to our own warm beds and wonder how long we can ignore the world for while the rain provides an alibi. Carver covers all this in his trademark sparse writing. He leaves us with a single solitary thought, the ringing of our own bells. Would I live my life over again if given half a chance? What did you think of the poem? As always, this is my interpretation, but I would love to hear yours. If you'd like to get in touch with me or suggest a poem that you'd like to hear on this podcast, you can do so in a number of ways. You can reach me directly by email at wordsthatburnpodcast@gmail.com. You can get in touch through the podcast website, www.wordsthatburnpodcast.com. I am on Instagram at Words That Burn Podcast. I am on TikTok at Words That Burn. You can leave me a comment on those channels, or you can go to the YouTube channel and leave me a comment there. I would love to hear from you. If you'd like to read the script for this week's podcast, complete with citations and sources, you can find it at the Substack link below in the description. As always, if you enjoyed this episode or have been enjoying the podcast or know someone who might, consider sending it to them directly or leaving me a review wherever you listen. Words That Burn is written and produced by me, Benjamin Colopy. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to the podcast again.